So I guess we're all ready to start now. Welcome to our second panel on comics journalism. This is organized in the context of the exhibition Zeichnen der Zeit, which you can see at the City Museum now. A lot of the works we're going to discuss today are on show in the exhibition. If you haven't seen them yet, you can of course always during the discussion just check them out on your smartphones, because every piece is available or accessible online for free. You just need to Google the name and maybe the media and you'll find them. I think this could be useful if you didn't see the exhibition to understand all the technical details and the artistic questions we're going to discuss. So we're going to start with a short introduction of our 5 speakers. You see we are many, so it's going to be even more exciting. I'll start with Emil Ernst to my left. He is a Danish illustrator and comic artist and has just got his BA in graphic storytelling from the animation workshop at VIA University Viborg. He has done a few self-publications with very enticing titles, as I find, as Disconnector and Master of Ninjutsu. He recently published a piece on the American comics journalism magazine The Myth, which we are going to discuss later. It's called How We Nuke, and it deals with the political mechanism set into place in the US once the nuclear attack is suspected. He is also an animation director, and his debut film just premiered this winter. Now, to my right, Bo Soremsky is a Berlin-based illustrator and comic artist. In his MA thesis, he focused on reportage drawing and has pursued this on and off ever since. The outcome of this work was an interactive nonlinear digital reportage called Der Kachelmann-Prozess, the Kachelmann trial, which focused on the very controversial trial of a German TV presenter. For those of you who don't know this man who was accused of raping his girlfriend. And this is on show in our exhibition, and he also collaborated with Arte on a TV documentary called Das Tal der Saphire, or The Cursed Valley of Sapphires, about sapphire mining in Madagascar, and to which he contributed several animated sequences. He is also a correspondent for Urban Sketches Berlin and the organizer of a heavy metal festival called Dom Open Air. And to Bo's right, Lothar Müller has been deputy head of the editorial department of Arte Reportage since 2009. In the beginning of his career, he worked as a reporter for Radio Bremen, then transitioned to Arte in 1997, so he has been there for quite a while, in different parts or sections of Arte, Arte and Info, and also the news programs. And now, working in Arte Reportage, he has played an important role in introducing comics into more of the Arte programs. Now, to the right of Emil, Eva Hilhorst is a Dutch comic artist, graphic journalist, and the founder of Drawing the Times. Drawing the Times is an online platform for graphic journalism. She worked as a freelance graphic journalist and illustrator in Brussels and Amsterdam, and in 2015 launched her platform. In 2016-17 initiated a contest, Croque ton histoire, or Scribble Your Story, together with Free Press Unlimited, for graphic journalists from 6 different African countries who were asked to submit different pieces, and the winners were then published on Drawing the Times. She also teaches at the University of Arts in Utrecht and is a speaker on graphic journalism in different festivals and events like today. And to Eva's left, you will find Patrick Chappatte, one of the pioneers, one could say, of comics journalism. He started working as a graphic reporter in the 90s, mostly on human rights topics such as the war in Gaza, or slums in Nairobi, or gang violence in Central America. Recently, in 2016, he started a project called Windows on Death Row, which wants to foster a debate in the US about capital punishment. And this multimedia project also had as one part a web series inside a death row of different graphic reportages, which was published on the New York Times. Patrick is also a very prolific editorial cartoonist and has been publishing in various international media, including the New York Times since 2001. He's also the founder of a foundation, Cartooning for Peace, for cartoonists from crisis regions. So now you see we have very different speakers. All of them do comics or graphic journalism of some kind online. Yesterday we already had a long debate about how comics journalism could work in the media, but mostly traditional. How could it work in print or maybe in TV? Today we're really going to focus on the digital possibilities. And we start with a kind of controversial premise. It is often said that the recent boom in comics journalism was only possible because of the internet. This is what people like to claim, and what we want to find out today, if this could be true, if maybe the internet or any kind of online platform give more opportunities to comic journalists than other media or other platforms. So my first question goes to Eva Hilhorst. I remember you telling me when you set up Drawing the Times, you really spent a lot of time and effort on the website design because you wanted to create something that really showcases comics online at their best. So what would you say were the biggest challenges for you in the beginning?
Everybody hear me? Well, it would, I think comics look best in print anyway. It's a challenge to read a comic on a mobile phone because you only see one panel and it's not the layout of the page. So it's important that comics are made in a different way. You shouldn't fill a whole big page with a lot of text because then you cannot read it online very well. But still, if you know in advance that you need to read it on mobile phones and laptops and iPads, and you can consider it and make it not too dense or make different short panels that you can scroll or swipe. That's how we made the layout of the website.
Another thing is that in general, connected with Drawing the Times, you don't really speak of comics journalism, but you call this work graphic journalism. We didn't really touch on that yesterday, but there is not only one term describing this kind of new journalism, so could you maybe let us know what, in your opinion, is the difference, or if it's describing the same thing and you just prefer another term?
Well, I think it's always a discussion in comics and serious comics, because comics means funny, and a lot of comics aren't funny at all. So that's a bit a strange name for a drawn story. And also, I think it depends on the language. Like in French, you say bande dessinée, like and in Dutch we call it strip. So it suggests that you have a strip of panels. In a graphic reportage, you don't need to use panels. You can also use just one drawing or a collage or different forms of drawing. That's why I prefer graphic journalism instead of comics.
So there is another famous platform for graphic journalism, apart from Drawing the Times. I already mentioned the NIB before, and we have one contributor here, Emil. Your story really struck me as very, very special because you delve very deep into the mechanisms, the US mechanisms to do with nuclear arms defense and attack. How did you end up doing this piece for the NIB? Because as far as I know, it's the first time you did a journalistic piece.
Yeah, so it started, I already knew Andy Warner, who was my editor. We had him as a teacher at the animation workshop. And then for a while I wanted to maybe make something for the NIB, because I think I really like what they put out, and then eventually Trump tweeted his tweet about his nuclear button being bigger than Kim Jong-un's. And so originally the title of the comic was going to be "Mine is bigger," centering on that pond, but it wound up being something different instead.
Why did you not use that title? I mean, now it's called How We Knew.
Yeah, well, it's because of the schedule of making it, and like at the point it came out, I think people had already forgotten it. News moves so fast.
So when you were asked to do that piece, you already knew it would be for an online publication. So you're probably not thinking in pages and page layouts. How did that influence how you conceived of your piece from the beginning, knowing that it's a digital piece?
I mean, I definitely tried to take that as a challenge and make something that was purely digital, which is why you see it's got animated panels, and it's very much formatted as a scroll comic for online reading or reading on your mobile phone. I think like the scroll, if there's anything that digital media has done for comics, it's kind of give us an entirely new format in the scroll comic. In that it's just a completely different and I think almost more immediate reading experience reading a scroll comic than it is to read something that's on a page or structured on a page. But you also get like, so usually when you have a comics page as the atom of the comics medium, then you get to then the page layout might tell you something about what's going on in the page, whereas when it's a scroll comic, you're like so zoomed in on it. But I tried to think a lot about how I could make it digital exclusive or like.
Patrick, your web series Inside Death Row was also conceived as a digital reportage. It was known before it would be published in the online edition of New York Times, and it was the first time ever they did any kind of graphic journalism. So you were kind of the first ones who set the bar. And in general, your project Windows on Death Row, which encompasses this web series, includes a lot of media, digital and analog. I mean, you always have, of course, the digital reportage, but you also have video, you have audio, you have an exhibition with prints, and you have the actual original of the inmates. When you conceived of this whole project using so many different media, how did that shape your idea of how this reportage in general should work?
Yes, as you said, there's two things. There's a broader project, Windows on Death Row, and based on that work that we did with my wife, who's a journalist and reporter, I had from the start the idea of doing graphic journalism series for the New York Times, and I knew that the best way to convince the New York Times was to offer an online solution, because it's difficult to find real estate in the print media. But as you alluded to, the web is wide open, so it allows for a lot of possibilities. To go back, so I'm going to talk about that aspect of things, because the broader project is another discussion. But I started doing comics journalism or graphic journalism around, and we could spend an hour speaking about how to call it and what's the definition of it. But I started around 1995, which makes me look like a dinosaur. And then around 10 years ago, because I thought that, I mean, we're coming from all that different directions. As I was starting, Joe Sacco was, I think, also starting around the same time, and he was coming from the world of comics, and I was coming from the world of the media, being a political cartoonist. And I've been working in that world of the media, trying to bring the language of comics or graphic novels into, newspapers and now websites. And so 10 years ago, I felt that it's nice to have your story published in a newspaper. It looks really nice. But it's true that, and you can do books, and you can do films. I did a film in 2011. So animated graphic journalism, that's another one we can explore and talk about. But I felt that the web offered a lot of possibilities, especially as an archive base for those stories, a place where you can go to and look at stories. So I started a website, graphicjournalism.com, because it was free 10 years ago. And that was I'm with you on how to call it, but I have to say that now that this genre has gained some visibility, I guess the comics journalism name has won, at least in the US, they really call it comics journalism. And then, so just 2 years ago, I came up with that project. It was the first web-only project that I did, targeting the web, and that could allow me to propose 5 episodes, a 5-part series, like a documentary series. To be able to convince the New York Times, I had to build the whole website with my storyboard. I had to storyboard all 5 episodes, and that was, I thought, the only way to get them to understand how it would work, from a starting page with 5 different episodes and how it would develop, and it would be the only way for them to get, the impression that it is valid as a journalistic genre, comics is, that I think we're all convinced of. And what was very interesting with that experiment is that when we talk about the internet, and I mentioned the website I started, you bump into the technical issues really fast. I mean, 10 years ago, it was Flash. A few years later, Flash didn't work anymore. So half of my stories on graphic journalism are not visible on an iPad or iPhone. It's a mess. Now it's, what is it now, HTML5? I'm not even sure. I'm not a technician. You have to be everything. A cartoonist, a writer, an editor, and you have to be a tech guy. So the interesting thing with the New York Times is they code everything from scratch, and they were very conservative in the format. They wanted it very simple. But one thing that they wanted and they coded was the verse. I mean, you can read the story differently from the desktop to the smartphone, and that's the whole challenge, another tech challenge. So on the desktop, it does look like a comics page with 6 panels, a grid of 6 panels, and when you switch to the smartphone, you can kind of scroll it panel by panel. But they had to code the whole experience, and I think that's the main limitation of the web world, is that the tech is changing all the time. The formats are changing, so you do something and then it might not be valid or even something you can read a few years down the road. So that's why and I've seen amazing animated things using different types of codes, but it is a good idea to keep it simple and to keep it visible on most browsers, because that's another problem, the different browsers. And that was one of the challenges that we had.
And you also mentioned that most of your other projects were not actually web-based. We have one of them in our exhibition, Gangnam Style, which was made for Chappatte, the Swiss magazine, in 2014. So it was conceived as a print reportage. How did that change the way you went about writing and drawing your piece?
Well, not much, except that when you draw for print, first, it's amazing. I started in 95, and then in 98, I started doing that regularly, like 2-3 times a year in the media, because you have to find a place to be able to do that. So you have to find an editor who's willing to give you the space. And again, real estate is very expensive in newspapers. So Lothar in Geneva had an editor who was, like me, a fan of comics and graphic novels. And they would give me 3-4 pages of the newspaper. So that's like and it was amazing. It would be page 2, 3, 4, for example. You would open the newspaper and have a full page comics. So that's, and when you work on that space, real estate is very expensive, so you need to, it's not, you need to limit, I mean, you don't have much space to develop the characters, to develop the atmosphere. It's not the language of comics, actually. It's very condensed. It's more like a video montage in a way. But, so working with the web, you don't have that limitation, and you can expand a little bit more, which is what I did with the New York Times series. It's a little bit more, it gives a little more space to characters. I can use more panels than I would on print. But still, it's a hybrid between a real graphic novel and the request of reporting, which is a totally different world. I think we're talking about a strange beast, comics journalism, that is in between graphic novels and journalism.
You gave me a very good transition to Bo now, because he kind of worked in a video montage environment, or at least he made a TV report. He was part of the crew. And when you did Cursed Valley of Sapphires for Arte Reportage, you were one of the team actually going to Madagascar as a comic artist who was supposed to contribute animated sequences to this TV documentary. Now, how did that work?
So when we went there, actually nobody really knew what. So nobody of us had done this before. So there was this journalist, Müller, and camera woman, and they were really experienced journalists, but they'd never worked with an animator or comic artist or something like that. So at the beginning we were just thinking, okay, how can we do this? We wanted to do a movie, it's about half an hour I think, and there are small parts are animated. So we went there and did our research for 2 weeks and tried to find out during the research which parts of the story might fit to animation or drawing. And while being there at the evening, we were always together and okay, so this would be a nice part for the reportage. And this part we can do the drawings. And yeah, so slowly we built the story, and after we came back, we changed much of this, because when you're there in the field, you don't really know what happens and what exactly is the story going to look at the end. Because you have an idea what you want to tell, but you've never been there before, so we have to find out what it's all about. Yeah, so it was a long process of thinking about how to tell the story and which way. And finally, I did a cut of the movie with gaps in between, and I filled in the drawings basically.
And how did you decide which sequences specifically you would animate and why?
So the main idea was to show things the camera couldn't capture. So these things like, people who live there are very poor, and we asked them, what do you wish for your future? If you're lucky enough to find a big sapphire or something like that. And they told us, and this was something I illustrated. Or there was a small sequence about accidents, where somebody was caught in, what's it called in English? Down the tunnels of the mines, yeah. They collapsed and he was trapped there, and obviously there was no camera to capture what happened there, so they told us what happened and I do this. So there were many different small stories where the camera wasn't able to capture it, because it was in the past or it was in the mind of the people, and these were the things I did.
So now one could say that Arte specifically has a very long history of working with comics, and not just animated but also static, especially more so maybe since there have been more online and web programs. Now Uwe, how would you describe the general approach of Arte to comics within their journalistic programs?
It's quite natural, because Arte is a German-French cultural channel, and 50% are French people. French people are very fond of bande dessinée, of graphic novels. It's a very big tradition. And I consider myself too, like Patrick, as a dinosaur here, because I knew about cartoons since we broadcasted his cartoons. It's a very early story, because it's now like 15 years ago. We started in our broadcasting Arte reportage once a month to show not only reports, but cartoons too. There's a weekly newspaper in France called Courrier International. They're translating international articles all over the world, and they're publishing the cartoons all over the world. And we thought it would be a nice idea if we are broadcasting reports from all over the year, from all over the world. We could show these cartoons too. So the head of Courrier International once a month showed us cartoons, and a lot of your cartoons I liked very much at that time. We liked him so much that we already sent another cartoonist to make a portrait of him at Arte. And then the French people being very fond of cartoons and of bande dessinée and graphic novels, we started 6 years ago now a web documentary about refugees. And the idea was to send 4 artists in one refugee camp, in 4 refugee camps all over the world. One in Nepal, one in Chad, one in Lebanon, one in, what was the other? Nepal? Yeah, Iraq, yes. And the idea was to send one cinema, realizator, no? one director, cinema director, one cartoonist, one writer, and one photographer for 1 week in a refugee camp, and to let them find a story and tell that story in their way. And this is the first time that we broadcasted online graphic novels about refugee camps. From Nicolas Wild, Reinhard Kleist was there, Didier Kassai, Damien Glaise, Cyril Pommes, Lucie Castel, this is the last one remaining in Calais. So at that time, the project for refugees was a huge program. It was very, very big, because we had 4 camps all over the world, 16 artists, and then we added two times, now the new thing will be broadcasted about Calais, so we had 6 chapters of refugees. And within that time, the idea came to try to implement cartoons, graphic novel in a report. And we thought about how could we do this, and it should have been a timeless story, or a story which should be ended very, very, very fast, because you don't have to, the schedule is different. We saw that everybody of the, I'm sorry to tell you that, but everybody of the artists was later than we thought. But not only the cartoonists, yeah, too. So we came up with the idea to send my colleague, the reporter Müller, to Madagascar, and he looked out for a very talented young guy, Soremsky, and they found him, and they went there. And this was an interesting trip for us, because it was very new, and I was talking a lot about with Michael, and for us now it's quite obvious that we're sending reporters out in the world, and often they have a second camera, or they have somebody with a drone or something. So it's obvious, as a TV reporter, you're always working in a team. So, for example, if the reporter makes some research, the cameraman starts to work. So you're used to try to work independently, or together. And this, with Bo, just added 1 more person to the team. So, and for me, Michael, I was talking with him, it was very interesting for him too, because he said, sometimes we were filming and Bo did something different, but we always knew what we'd done. So, and it was just something very complimentary, and it was very interesting because he could tell stories we couldn't tell. And this makes the story very rich. And this is very interesting, and we tried that in several occasions. It was the first thing. We broadcasted once a report about how difficult it is for the Chinese migrants in Italy, for the 3rd generation to become familiar with in Italy. And the idea was, we send a comic reporter to Paris to tell us a story about the 3rd Chinese generation in Paris too. And we made a report about the new mayor of Madrid from Podemos, and we made a report about it. And there was a comic reporter telling us about a story online for what's going on in Madrid now at that time. And we tried it on several occasions, and this is something we're experimenting, and we're not ready with all of this. And the idea is next time maybe to send out a reporter with a cartoonist, graphic artist, graphic novel artist, but we'll continue. So that's about all. Yeah.
So one point you raised that was already discussed yesterday on the panel was that comic artists as reporters could make the invisible visible, like the scenes you were describing that were told to you but that you weren't there for to report on film. Do you think there are any other aspects that comics journalism could be interesting online, like other than maybe in this TV format, how it could be used not only to show invisible things but to add something else? Did you ever work on that with Arte, or is that the next step?
There's an interesting documentary about the Iran Revolution, just before the Arab Spring. It's 10 years ago now. In Iran, there was a little revolution that was hit down by the government, and there was a documentarist who made a film about that with the messages in the social media, and he made a graphic novel film about that Iran Revolution, and he took just everything what was sent to other people by email, by Twitter at that time. I think it was Twitter still, and with these elements he told the story of that revolution. The problem with comics and journalism is ethics. Because I'm a little bit concerned now to defend journalism. When you see how in the last 20 years news and information changed, we have now an everyday tsunami of news, of opinions, of paste and copy, of fake news. Even the president who's considering everything as fake news without just what he says is the truth, you know. I'm a little bit concerned to defend the journalism because as a journalist you have, well, there are journalists with no ethics, okay. But I consider myself as a journalist with ethics, and I think a journalist should be able to tell the truth and try to tell the truth. Even if you can't tell always all the truth, that's okay. But you have to have your ethics, and you have to be a voice that people can trust in. And that's the only problem. That's the problem about the internet. That's also the problem maybe about comic reports. Can you trust what they tell you?
But why would that be a problem? I have the feeling that, because I'm from both worlds, right? I'm coming from the world of political cartoons and comics journalism. And I have the feeling that, especially now with the fake news phenomenon, it makes comics journalism, sorry to call it that way, but even more relevant. Why? Because you have honesty. I mean, maybe you don't have the objectivity that is being taught in journalism schools. And I went to a journalism school. I was a writer before I became a cartoonist. I was writing in newspapers before I was drawing. And so you don't aim for that in the world of comics, but you have, and I'm very much in line with Joe Sacco, and I have very much the same approach, which is to be a part, it's a narrative tool that is very useful and that works very well with comics, doesn't work so well with other media. To be part of the story as the narrator, to take the readers by the hand and to show them what you see, and to be honest about it. And that's a value that is very much relevant today, because in an age where you don't know what is true or not true, what is manipulation or not, you have someone telling you this is who I am and this is what I saw. And even as a comic journalist, very often I lay out my doubts, I lay out what I didn't understand about the situation, and this is part of the story.
That's a good point, because this is what I wanted to say. You know, if you were a reporter, you know about that. And that's the thing, you know, a reporter does the same thing. A reporter is somebody who goes out to tell a story, to investigate about a story, and then try to tell the truth as far as he can tell it. And he has to be aware of that maybe it's not all the truth he can tell, and he has to be aware of that he should be honest with all his investigating. And this is what I think this is the role of a comic reporter too. And if you can trust in these guys, it's wonderful, because it's very interesting. As I said, you know, the documentary about the Iran Revolution is very interesting, because you have the objective thing, or the subjective thing. You have the messages from people in Iran suffering, telling about a revolution, a hidden revolution, because there were no pictures of that revolution, because they did not let the pictures out. And at that time, social media was not as developed as 2-3 years after it. The Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was mainly fired up by social media too. But there were no pictures out of Iran. And so he tried to tell with these little messages the real story, a real subjective story of something that happened. And this was very honest, because it was very, very close to the truth. Because these were real people telling us something, but you could not see the pictures. And somebody designed the pictures. And that was a pretty good film.
What's the name?
No, I forgot about it. I can't send it to you.
Is that the Green Wave? Is that?
Yeah, I think it's that.
That's one?
Yeah.
With the cartoons and actual.
Yeah, I think it's that one. Yeah.
I think a very good example of this idea of an honest reporter is your animation film, Patrick, Death in the Field, which is also in the exhibition, which started as a comic, a static comic for Lothar in Geneva, and then was later made by you into an animated film. So it's like, to just give you some context, the film deals with families living in southern Lebanon and how they are suffering from cluster munition or accidents involving cluster munition left over from the war between Israel and Hezbollah. So in that film you can always see you as a reporter walking around, sometimes looking like you're not very sure where you are going. Could you explain to us how you did that piece and what making it into a movie afterwards changed, if you added any new layers of meaning?
So ever since I started, I was curious about the idea of translating, because I was interested in bringing the world of comics, the language of comics to the media, but then I thought transferring that language to television. How does it work to have animated graphic journalism? And of course, when I saw Vals with Bashir, the film that I hope all of you saw, I was like, wow, this is exactly what I was thinking about. A full documentary in animation. And so I wanted to experiment with that, but I just didn't have time. So in 2009, I went to South Lebanon with the help of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And that's interesting because some institutions have started to understand the interest and the power of images and of graphic journalism in telling their story as well. So I went with them. I had access to those really minefields. I mean, to those places that were infested by cluster munitions. And I wanted to tell the story of how a war doesn't end when it ends, but it goes on for years and years and years, and it keeps on killing people. And that was a story for Lothar with the ICRC, and then I went back to them and I convinced them to help me make it into a film, 11 minutes film. And my goal was to have that film really on TV. My goal, and I partly succeeded, it was to be on a magazine segment on TV, not on websites, but really to be where people don't expect that to happen. And it was the case on Swiss French TV. I was on like a 60 minutes show on Sunday night, where they have different 10-minute segments, and this story was one of them, an animated segment. So that was a total surprise for the viewers, and I think that's what is interesting, is to bring that language to people who don't read comics, or wouldn't go to see an animated film maybe. And then it was not with Arte, but it was co-produced with Canal Plus, so it was on Canal Plus, and it toured a few documentary festivals, not comics, not animation festivals, but documentary festivals. And that was interesting, because that's the point, reaching out to those audiences and showing them something in a different language. And I think there's a whole, I don't know about Arte, is it only on the website that you do the okay, so there's a whole world that is still yet to be explored, and it's the world of TV. But what I found out just about that is this was my first try, and only one so far, is that TV is very conservative. Because we would go to different TV channels and they would say, oh, but we don't have that format. And I would say, no, of course you don't, it's new, that's the idea. Oh, yeah, but we don't have like, 11 minutes animation reportage. Of course you don't. That's the point. So it was very hard to get it to TV. It was aired on Swiss German TV, but in a kind of artsy magazine for cutting-edge things. That was not my idea. That was not my intent.
Now, Eva, you also did a couple of projects with Drawing the Times involving, about human rights topics, but mostly involving West and East African countries. And you often work with graphic journalists from those countries. As far as I know, you cannot travel to all of them. So it's very important that your platform is online. What is your approach in working on those human rights topics and also working with people who come from those communities or countries?
First of all, I agree with you, Uwe, on the fake news thing, and that you cannot trust the old-fashioned media anymore, because you never know who's telling the truth. But I think the one big advantage of the internet is that it is accessible to anyone, and anyone can be heard or seen through the internet, unless you are in a country where there's a lot of censorship. But I'm very interested in hearing and reading stories from people that are talking about their own lives and how it is in their own country. And I think media always had used correspondence to go to faraway countries and report about those exotic places in the newspapers and on television, and that was really from our Western point of view. And I think it's very interesting to have stories from people who show us how they see their own lives and how they want to portray their own lives to us. I think media is still some kind of the Western world used to colonize the world, and I think it was the same in the media. I think it's time that we have see people everywhere as equal persons with interesting stories and that are interesting for us to hear. And so when it comes to human rights, it's not for us to judge who's bad or who's good, but if they can show us with a very personal story, just not with no value in it, just to say this is how I live and it's up to you what you think about it. And if you have as many as possible of those stories, then you can have your own judgment about what's going on in the world. I think it's a totally different approach and a very big advantage of the internet that we should make much more use of.
And now maybe to take a concrete example, your competition, Scribble Your Story, had entries from Cameroon, Congo, Rwanda, and 3 other countries, I can't remember them.
Mali and Benin.
So how did you find graphic journalists in all those countries? And what could you say about their entries and also about the winning pieces in the end that you published on Drawing the Times?
I was working with a Belgian woman who had lived in all those countries and who was working with Belgian reporter Jeroen Jansen. I don't know if you heard about him. And she knew a lot of people in the comics scene, also Christophe Cassio, who has a lot of contacts in African countries. helped us find those artists. Some of these countries are really difficult with censorship, and the only news the people get is bad news. So they think that the world is a very bad place, and they never read any positive stories. So we asked them to make a positive story about their country. And then the funny thing was that, in Rwanda, you could see from the stories that there's a lot of censorship, and they wouldn't be very honest, I would say, about their lives. They would say, the president is a great guy, and Rwanda is the best country in the world, and you would know that that really wasn't the case. But the people in Cameroon, you could see they're not that hard there, and they were much more explicit about their situation and used a lot of humor. And I thought, well, it's really interesting to see that in comics you have also cultural differences and own languages that are different in different parts of the world, and it's really it enriches the language, I think, of media to have a totally different way of storytelling, more personal, more cultural, determined, and I think that's a great enrichment also in storytelling.
This is a very interesting point for comic reporters, even it's the same for TV reporters or writing reporters or radio reporters or any reporter, to go into places nobody goes to and to let people tell about their lives. This is what we're trying at Arte too. We had Didi Kassai was working for us in the Republic of Central Africa for about 1 year. He should have delivered all 2 weeks just like a diary of what's happening in the Central Republic of Africa after the war had ended and the new government was implemented. And he showed us in his cartoons, in his comics, the daily life of how it is to live in Central Africa. And the problem for us is to get it animated, because that's expensive and it's difficult. And we're trying very often now to animate it in a way with like you, Bo, but it's very much work. And then we try to animate it with our graphic possibilities, and even to put sound on it. But it's very expensive. It's very, because you're right, we're conservative, okay, but we're trying to show other things. And I think this is what I wanted to tell you about, to have an ethics as a comic reporter, just like a good reporter who has made a good, has a good education and believes in what he's doing. Try to tell the truth and try to be honest and try to be a voice that people can trust in. And that's important. And the main thing, and this is what everybody in our society admires, the New York Times. I still remember the New York Times on the front page, they still mention what they've done wrong. And this is very interesting, because you're making mistakes as a journalist, and maybe sometimes you're wrong, but if you're considering after the next story what you've done wrong, people begin to trust in you, because they see that you even are able to say, okay, that was not the right thing I told you. And this is a big chance for comic reporters, going out and showing things you can't see on TV, can't hear on radio.
That leads me to my next question, to Bo. Actually, what do you think, or do you think you could have animated that entire TV documentary about Madagascar if you had the time and the money? Of course, I mean, this is always a preoccupation, but do you think it would have added anything to this report? It would just be entirely animated without any film sequences?
I think it would have been a good idea to do this completely as an animation, because I think drawings are very good for specific topics, but I don't think that complete replacements would be very good, because there are some pictures who work better as a drawing, and other pictures work better as a photo or a video. And What's with Bashir, for example, is a great example for this, because it's nearly completely animated, but the last half minute or so is actual archive footage from the aftermath of this massacre which happened there. And this works really well. The main story of this movie is about a man who tries to find out what happened back there. And when he finally finds the truth, what happens, the movie switches to archive material which was actually filmed there, and which is the undeniable truth of what happened there. So it's not out of his mind that it really happened. And this is something photography is very good at, because when you look at a photo, you immediately think, you might think, okay, this is like a window to another place, and it's really there, it happens. So I can see it in the photo, so it's the truth. Obviously, this is wrong, because the photographer also chooses which part he's taking pictures. But in the drawing, you always see that it's an interpretation of the artist. And this is great for certain parts of the story, but I think the combination, especially in movies, there's a big, I think both worlds can add up to something more than just one, if you're doing just one part.
I would like to stay with animation just for a little bit more, because we have another animation director here. You use some very beautiful GIFs in your reportage, How We Nuke. I would like to know how you decided you were going to use them. Was it just because it's online so you can? And how did you then incorporate them in your whole piece?
I mean, initially, yeah, as I can. Because it's online and I want to experiment or whatever, but I think like in the final analysis, the addition of GIFs to the cartoonist's toolbox when making comics online isn't that game-changing. I see it more as just like, it's like drawing with a different kind of pencil or something. It's just something you do to add some sort of texture or to make something stand out. Because I think as soon as you use a GIF that isn't looping or isn't like an infinite point in time, then it kind of takes you out of the comic reading experience. Like, it takes you into the world of animation, which isn't comics. Like, I think the great thing about comics is that everything's standing still, but it's moving in your head. So yeah, in How We Nuke, I used the GIFs for setting up some kind of texture that told you that when stuff is blinking, it's like it's indicative of some kind of fear being present, and then eventually using that, wrapping it up at the end of the comic with Donald Trump having some kind of fear that maybe they're going to get attacked and he's going to launch a retaliatory strike before.
In the preparation for this panel, we were also discussing storytelling techniques, and I remember you writing that you have very specific items in your fiction toolbox, which you are kind of carrying into your journalistic comics to engage the reader. What kind of tools would that be?
I mean, I guess that's just like the tools of setting up these patterns, and then then repeating it so you know that when this is shown again, it means something specific without having to state it.
And now you just told me before you're working on a new piece for the NIL. How is that going to look?
Probably also very depressing and poisonous because it's about chemical warfare this time.
But are you going to use the same format, like a scroll comic?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a scroll comic.
Eva, you always stress that Drawing the Times is not only a publishing website but also an international community open to artists and illustrators from pretty much any country. So you organize workshops and competitions, as we heard, but also exhibitions. And of course, if most of the work created for you is meant to be online, and then you have to carry it over into an exhibition, that could in some way be kind of tricky. Like, how do you navigate between the two poles, or how do you decide which of the online reportages you show in exhibitions?
I think if it's a reportage that is made especially for online, like the ones on the list, sometimes they are really simple, like a few lines, because you have to be able to read it on your mobile phone. I wouldn't choose those kind of stories for an exhibition, because that wouldn't make it more interesting. But it's really nice if you could see the handwriting of the artist, which I think you lose a little bit on the internet. If you see the materials, if they use beautiful crayons or ink or oil paint, I don't know. If they are like works of art, then it's much more interesting to show them in an exhibition than digitally made canvas.
Patrick, you have some original artwork in your Windows on Death Row project, coming, of course, from you, but also from inmates of Death Row that you interviewed and that you stayed in touch with, and that were themselves drawing. So how difficult was it to incorporate those pieces? I think on the New York Times they use as frontispieces for the different chapters. But when do you have that idea to ask them for their work and incorporate it into yours?
Okay, so you're bringing me back to that wider project, so I'm going to talk about it. Windows on Death Row was, the idea of that project was to use art as a way to trigger a conversation on death row in the United States. And that's based on a series of projects that I've been doing in different countries, mostly working with cartoonists to address serious issues, because sometimes when you have issues where words don't work anymore, so you can try images. That's my philosophy. So I've been bringing together editorial cartoonists in different countries, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Serbia, Lebanon, Central America, about issues that are very relevant to their societies. And as I was moving to Los Angeles, I wanted to do a project about death penalty. And the idea there was, rather than to have, bring together cartoonists for and cartoonists against the death penalty. By the way, it was very hard to find any of my colleagues who would send any cartoon in defense of death penalty. I was very disappointed. So we had a different idea. It was to have views from inside and outside the prison world, because you can't bring cameras into death row. You cannot film into death row. So what we did with my wife, Frédéric, I asked my fellow US colleagues to send their cartoons about death penalty, and then we reached out to almost all of the death row inmates in the US, 3,000 of them. We mailed them and we asked them for their contributions in the form of art. We asked them to testify about what was going on death row. And so it took us, it was a big work. It took us 6 months to receive art and be confident that we had enough material to have that exhibition happen. And it started in 2015 in Los Angeles, the exhibition, with art coming out from death row inmates, some of them naive, some of them incredibly beautiful and almost professional, I would say, from people who had no access to images or to the internet. One of the participants who came out, actually, he's an exoneree, he's an innocent, who spent 25 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. and he did some incredibly beautiful paintings, only imagining the faces and imagining the colors, because obviously it's a very gray world, the world of prison. And to do that, we had to also travel across the United States, and we visited 4 maximum security prisons, and we made interviews, we made videos, and we had this exhibition tour the US from Los Angeles to Ohio, North Carolina, Texas, and New York. And in each venue, we had a panel. So again, it's using art as an excuse, in a way, to have a very serious debate. And I think it can work in the sense that people are convinced on the death penalty issue in the US. They're either very much against it or they are for it. It's hard to make them change their mind. But if you look at art, whatever your opinion, whatever you think of an issue, you just look at an image, and that image can trigger something. That image enters you, and it can actually, you know what happened? It's almost unbelievable, but at the opening in Los Angeles, a woman from Los Angeles came, and she was very much for the death penalty. And after seeing the exhibition and after hearing the innocent who came to the opening and told about his story, she said that she changed her mind. So if I did only one good thing with that project, it's this.
So another question to do with how to carry digital art into an analog space if you want to exhibit it and you don't want to use screens. Or an example of how maybe you could never do that is your work, Der Kachelmann-Prozess, the Kachelmann trial about the German TV presenter I was mentioning, because that uses a lot of interactive elements and a deliberately non-linear narration. Which you didn't only use because you could, but because you wanted to make a point about this trial. So maybe you could tell us a bit about how you developed that piece and why you deliberately used those interactive features.
Yeah, so this trial was quite problematic or complicated trial because there was no witness. Nobody witnessed the crime, so there basically was just your Kachelmann and the possible victim, the press called her Sabine, kept it this way, and they told their stories of what happened that night. And so you had these 2 stories, and one of them was obviously lying, but it wasn't possible to tell who was lying. So there were bunch of experts who were trying to find out, they were searching for these little clues and try to argue why Kachelmann was lying or why he was telling the truth. This was basically a very long trial with lots of opinions but no proof. So, and this, I tried to show this by showing this, all these arguments in a very subjective way. So, for example, when you're reading the arguments of the attorneys and their experts, you get the impression that they are right and that Kachelmann was guilty. You can also read the testimonies of the lawyers and the experts who spoke for Kachelmann, and you get the impression that he's innocent. So I had this very contradicting testimonies, and I put them in front of each other. And the reader has basically decided for himself, just like the judges had to decide at the end. And so I didn't even try to do something objective because it wasn't possible. It was just subjective opinions there. And by telling all these subjective opinions at the end, you have a kind of objective overview about the whole process. Yeah, and that was the idea, because I read a lot of press articles, and every article was at least a little bit biased, and it was just because of the order in which order you are presenting the arguments of these experts. define how important they are. So when you start with this argument and then in the other arguments they are contradicting, it's like automatically one gets more important than the other. And by doing this in a non-linear way, I was able to leave this problem to the reader. The reader could also say, okay, I don't even want to know the version of the victim. I believe in Kahneman, so it was completely up to him, to the reader or her. And that was the idea, to achieve some kind of objective piece by just using subjective quotes.
So for those of you who haven't seen that yet, it's basically an image of the courtroom with lots of different faces, and you could navigate across this highlighting, like tapping on different faces, and then it would zoom in, you see that person with some information about them, who they are and what their role is in the court trial. And if you click on them, you get additional information which comes from their statements or witness statements. If they're judges, then it turns back to what they were actually saying in the trial. So there is no possible linear way of reading this. I mean, it depends on where you tap and then you see something. So this kind of interactive element is really the most striking in that piece. As a comics reader or reader of comics journalistic pieces, I'm always wondering, when it comes to online, which possibilities might exist, even now as we're speaking, that aren't explored yet. And I would like to ask this to all of you, like this question for me is even almost the most important. Which possibilities do you see for the near future of using formats online that right now no one is doing yet? And you will get the copyright, of course, if you mention it now. We have the video proof.
I would like to start if you agree. I think I have 2 children who are teenagers, and I see, and I'm also teaching at university with 17, 18-year-olds. They're very much into gaming, and I think that if you could make smart games that can engage young people in what's going on in the world, and then they can make their own choices, or swipe to the right if you agree, swipe to the left if you disagree, so they can learn about history, backgrounds, context. That would be the next step for me.
What about the others? What do you think?
So I think the combination of drawings and other forms of expression that would be very interesting. Arte did a few things about this. And, this movie we did also is accompanied by a small online reportage which consists of drawings, small video pieces, sound effects, well not sound effects but sounds which were recorded there in Madagascar, and text. And this is quite interesting, but it's very basic, and I think we can do something much more impressive because there are really awesome interactive reportages which don't have any comics in it. So we're not talking about this here, but they are really great examples. And we could do the same with comics, completely with comics, or add comics to this to create very rich multimedia pieces. And the other thing is we are used to this linear storytelling, and also my non-linear piece is basically a linear, different linear stories, but you have a non-linear way to access them. And there's this, I think he's an American comic artist, Dan Archer, who did some experiments with this a few years ago. He did some very small experiments how to tell a story which is not linear. You can click on several panels and then a new world opens up with background stories, and then you can go back to the main story. Or he shows the same picture, but you can choose the time. So that I think it was about an incident in Iraq, in Baghdad in 2003. There was some kind of shooting out in the streets, and he just showed a picture, at the beginning of the shooting and during the shooting and at the end, and you scroll through the time, front and back, and you in this way find out what led to this incident, what happened. It's a completely different way than we are used to read stories, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, Dan Archer is, the last time I read about him, he was even working with augmented reality. I think he was trying to incorporate augmented reality into his comics journalistic pieces. But then, I mean, I followed this for a while, and I had the impression that he went more into like only augmented reality without comics. But I hope he's coming back soon.
At Arte we are trying to go with the flow. I can't tell you what's going on in the future. I can't even imagine, because if I'm looking at what happened, I'm 58 years now, and if I compare what we've done in television 20 years ago, what we can do now, what I see on the internet now, what is possible now, if you compare the first King Kong Godzilla films with Terminator 2, and it's incredible. And we're trying to go with the flow. And we're very open-minded. We're trying. For us, it's interesting because, as you mentioned, comic reports or distributing information in a different way is for us a way to find a younger public, find younger people who are interested in maybe they wouldn't even look at documentary at Arte, but if you find a way with comic reporters or graphic novels to distribute our things we would think are very important. That's what we like to go, and we will head on with that. And I'm very curious about how technology will develop possibilities to do that in the next 20 years. I think it will be overwhelming, and I'm very curious how we can work with that. You know, I was starting when I was starting with the reporters. We went out with one camera. Now every reporter has one camera, a GoPro, and has his iPhone, so you can even film things much more differently today. And if it's possible to make it with combination of comics or graphic novels, or like Bo with the comic reporter, it's very interesting. And I don't know what it leads to, but we're going with the flow, however people say that.
Can I add something? I think it's very important to still use drawing, hand drawing, because it's so personal, and if you lose yourself in technology, it's all pixels, and it's far away from real people, where people's handwriting keeps it more close to one's personality, and I think it's very important to add that to the technical developments.
Yeah, this is what we're trying. The last report now will be published. It's Lucy Castell, who made a story about, a fictional story about the destiny of a woman in Sudan who's a refugee going to Calais, and she made a lot of interviews. She spoke with a lot of women at Calais now, refugee women, and with that she created a story, a fictional story about a woman leaving Sudan, being raped, becoming pregnant, until she arrives to Calais, and she's telling stories with that fictional character, which are real stories. And this is very interesting, because she's in some way she looks behind the curtain, and then we had this as a drawn by her, and we tried to animate it with sound and movement, and it's still not very lively, but it's an interesting way to develop it further, you know.
What do you think, Emil? Which possibilities are there that you haven't tried yet, or anyone hasn't tried yet?
I don't know. I probably say the same. That it's just I want to try, like trying to incorporate comics with other media. And, yeah, but I think that's going to be very hard. I've got a friend who just got a job at like a Danish TV station where they wanted to start being a bit more experimental, doing some comic stuff, and literally everything she suggests to them, they're like, that's a cool idea, I'm not going to do that. Yeah. So I think it's going to take a while, but...
What about you, Patrick?
We have a Gespräch at 7 tonight. I'm going to tell you everything about it.
Okay.
But about your point, we're always torn between the technology and we have to be everything at the same time again. Writers, narrators, cartoonists and tech guys. So we're always tempted by all those technologies. I'm getting crazy every day thinking about virtual reality and augmented reality and all that sort of things. I got all excited when I had my iPad Pro and I started doing the 4 first episodes of the Death Row, the New York Times series on my iPad Pro, and then I got so many hours of physiotherapy that I had to switch back to paper for the 5th and last episode. So be careful with that temptation that is always there. It's beautiful, comics journalism, graphic journalism, because coming from the world of the media, the media, they try to reach out to new audiences. They want to be multi-platform, and there is nothing as versatile as graphic novels. I could do the same. I did the same story in print for a newspaper, in a book, for a collection of stories, online for a slideshow, or in the form of a film for television. So. I mean, yes, we can play with everything. All the tools are there, but we just need to remember at the very end, wherever you go, whatever technology you choose, it's always about the story. It's about the story, and it's about finding the best way to tell your story. And I haven't found yet a perfect way to tell a meaningful story using 360 virtual reality images, for example. But I'm still thinking about it.
Now we have a few minutes left, although it's very hot in here, I know. For you to ask questions, if you have any, please just show up and tell us if you want to ask anything that we didn't cover so far. Yes?
Yeah, I actually, I don't know whether it's much of a question, but I was intrigued by your discussion of trust in the media. But I want to challenge the category of honesty that at least some of you use, because the idea behind it is if I understood you correctly, that comics journalism is more honest because it's so obviously subjective, right? Because there's no attempt to make the reader see this as a representation of reality, because it's not a picture, it's not a film, it's not a photo, it's not a film, it's a drawing. So quite obviously some artist has made the decisions, and so it's honest. But I think that doesn't absolve comic journalists of following journalistic practice, of being professional about journalistic practice, because I think this honest subjective approach is something we tend to like at this point in time, because most comics journalists are progressive. The right-wing extremists have not discovered this medium. But just imagine an honest right-wing extremist doing a subjective version of any of the stories that you are telling from their honest perspective, and you see where I'm getting at.
Who has a take on that? Yeah,
okay. It's very short. What is true is that most comic journalists don't have a journalistic education. They're just going out and doing what they think is right. It definitely would be helpful for us to learn a little bit more about journalists, the way journalists work. Just to, like talking about sources, to prove that you're right, that you didn't lie. I don't really know how to do this, for example. I can just think, okay, I will do this. it would be great for universities, for example, to offer something like that, or workshops or something like that. But on the other hand, there are right-wing journalists who are not who are taking photos or writing scripts, and so left-wings are complaining about this, and so it's the same, right? Nobody is saying comic journalists are honest and that's good because of their opinion. I think that's not connected to each other. When somebody goes to a place and reports about this, you can decide if you believe it or not, and that's not connected to the opinion of the author.
This is why I was talking about ethics. You know, you have liars everywhere. You have even liars which are journalists. You know, every journalist can be a liar. Everybody is a liar. Someone in his life, sometimes in his life. The thing is, ethics. To have somebody you can trust in because he's just telling you where he's got his information from, or he's just trying to hear the other opinion. It's just trying to, like you did with the Kapelman process, just to open up so that you can look at yourself, being honest about the sources you have. And this is the main thing, trying to tell the truth and trying to do it in a professional way. And this is what we have to try very hard as journalists, because if we don't do that anymore, we will get lost. You know, nobody will trust us. Look what's going on in the United States of America. If you see Fox News, everything Trump is doing is wonderful. If you look at CNN, it's all bullshit, and there's a lot of bullshit he's doing. But I'm trying as much as possible to read, if you want, left-wing, right-wing, middle-wing medias, because I'm very, very interested in, if you're making commentaries about another opinion of somebody, what does he think about that, what I'm thinking, and can you do research with that? Is it interesting? Is it something that develops your opinion? Is it something that can tell us what you think about the world? And this is what we have to do, and be honest, you know. This is what, because I was talking about ethics, and this is, you know, I remember some years ago people said, "Oh God, it's wonderful you have the internet. There's the truth." I think in the internet there's as much as liars and truth as everywhere, but you have to distinguish. You have to be able to distinguish who's a liar and who's not a liar, who's a populist, who not. And this is a problem of to be trusted. And this is the problem of ethics today. So be honest, try to tell where you get your information from, and don't paste and copy. And if you're making a report is something which is quite personal. You know, news is facts. You have figures, you have deaths, best people, you have everything. But if news is facts, and report is more subjective. The report is something. If you see a good report, the report depends on the person of the reporter too, you know, because are you able to open up the minds of the people you're meeting? If you're not, it won't be an interesting report. A report tells human stories and combines it with facts, and a good report tells you where he's got his facts from and his figures from, and is trying to interview also the other side, the people who are against it. So that you, like you did it with Kapelman, that you're able to see a maximum of the possibility of what is true. And this is what I was talking about ethics. And this is interesting. And if you don't follow that as a comic reporter, or as a reporter like me, you're fucked up. I'm sorry, but this is what I'm trying to defend. You know, this is what I'm concerned of. I don't care if it's a good story, a true story. I don't care if it's a radio reporter who did it, a comic reporter, or a TV reporter, or a writer. It has to be a good and interesting, well-made story. Somebody who is an honest guy or woman.
Well, I think this is a good closing statement. We're actually running out of time. Thank you everyone for being here. for giving us your thoughts on online comics journalism. We can continue all these discussions at 6 p.m. because there's a small reception at the exhibition. If you haven't seen it yet, you're very welcome to come. There'll be drinks and very short speeches, I promise. And we are going to have an artist talk with Patrick afterwards at 7 p.m, to which you are very welcome as well. He will talk more about his last project, Windows on Death Row, and on his work in general. So thank you for coming and see you at the museum.